All right, a very good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric, as Tiffany has introduced. And first of all, I'd like to thank the Singapore Chinese Chamber of Commerce and Industry for organizing this event and inviting IPOS and IPOS International to speak. And a special shout out to Tiffany and Carrie from SCCCI for their help. We really appreciate it. Now, for those of you who sign up, right, just to clarify, because I do get this question quite a fair bit, this is, the IP here actually means intellectual property and not internet protocol. So for those of you who actually sign up thinking that, oh, is this actually about how to use a computer to go global? It's not really that. So it's about how to leverage on your intellectual property to actually move overseas. So moving on to the next slide. So just to keep a very quick introduction about who IPOS as well as IPOS International is. So IPOS is actually the government agency under the Ministry of Law. And primarily what we do in IPOS is that we are the registry for trademarks, patents, and designs. So if you want to file a patent, trademark, or design registration in Singapore, you need to lodge this over with IPOS. And for IPOS International, that's where I come from. We are a wholly owned subsidiary of IPOS, and we are also the expertise and enterprise engagement arm. And under IPOS International, we have over 100 IP experts under one roof. And the joint vision between IPOS and IPOS International really is to find a Singapore where innovative enterprises use IP and intangible assets to grow. So that's a very quick overview about who IPOS and IPOS International is. And for IPOS International, we basically have 3 different business unit lines. So number 1 on the leftmost right, we help you to unlock business value using your intangible asset strategy. So these are business solutions that are actually centered in helping you to grow using your intangible assets. So that's our consultancy arm. And in the middle part of it, gaining industry insights with pattern search and analysis. So this is what we call our search and examination arm. So for those of you who are not familiar with the search and examination, the whole process is like this. When you file a patent application in Singapore or anywhere else, right, you need to go through a process of what we call a search and examination to determine whether your invention can actually be allowed to run. So this is the unit that actually looks into that. Now, apart from that, the search and examination arm, we also help different companies as well as government agencies to find out what are the newest areas where people are actually innovating in. So this can be in the form of a patent landscape to find out, to say, for example, autonomous vehicle, right? Who are the key players who are actually inventing in that space, who are actually putting money into these kind of resources to develop autonomous vehicles. So they can actually help you to provide this kind of patent landscape information. And finally, on the rightmost column, this is where we can actually help to build capabilities in terms of IP training and education. So and that's under the subsidiary, which is called IP Academy. So in IP Academy, what we do is education and training, and we train across a variety of different kinds of training, from half-day programs all the way until to a master's level program that we partner with the Singapore University of Social Sciences. All right, so that's just to give you a very quick understanding and overview about who IPOS and IPOS International are. So I would like to share this slide because I think it's a very interesting one, and personally, I don't know whether to be happy or to be sad when I actually see this. Because the playwright Oscar Wilde actually said before, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery that mediocrity can pay to greatness. So essentially, if someone is imitating you, right, they're paying you a good compliment to say that you're actually great, right? So this actually happened here. This actually happened in China. So I believe a lot of you will know who Charles & Keith is, right? So it's a big brand that actually is Singapore grown. And they manufacture or they sell a lot of different leather products with regards to shoes as well as handbags and lifestyle accessories. So you see at the top, that's the original Charles & Keith shop. And below, you see there's this thing which is called, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I'm trying to call it, I think, Charles & Keith. Right, so this was actually kind of like copied in China by a company which is called Guangzhou Yantai Leather. And the copycat's product range storefront and even the website is very similar to the original Charles & Keith. So this is a problem that's actually happening in China. And I wanted to show this to you to say that, you know, there are instances where Singapore companies where actually when they venture overseas, they do come across issues like this. And by the way, if you're not aware, LVMH or, you know, Moet, Hennessy, Louis Vuitton actually acquired 20% of Charles & Keith back in 2014 for about $30 million. So Charles & Keith is a very big brand name now globally. And to see this happening in China, it's a bit sad, but I think in a way, it's kind of like also showing that the Singapore brand has actually made it such that people want to copy them overseas. The silver lining is that this copycat was actually called out by some of the users. So what happened is that some of these Chinese consumers went into the shop below, Charles & Keith, bought products thinking that they were actually belonging to Charles & Keith. So why would this happen is because, as you know, in China, the primary language is actually Chinese. So to them, the English words sometimes may not actually stand out as clearly to them. So they went into the shop thinking that they were actually buying Charles & Keith products, but actually turns out to be from a copycat. All right, so before I go into the details of the IP playbook for going global today, I thought it'd be good to lay some groundwork on what actually IP is, and in a larger context, what are intangible assets in the next slide. So what are intangible assets? I'm going to distinguish them between intangible as well as tangible assets. So if you look at this slide on the left most corner, tangible assets are primarily what we call physical assets. So this can be cash, land, equipment, machinery, furniture. So things you can feel, see, and touch. Whereas intangible assets, right, are things like your patents, trademarks, copyright, internet domain names, customer lists, employment contracts, and so on and so forth. So one of the key differentiating factor is, as the name suggests itself, right? One is tangible, which you can see, you can touch, you can feel. One is intangible, you can't really see it. So it's kind of like non-physical in nature. The other differentiating part between tangible and intangible assets is that tangible assets can be destroyed because they're physical in nature, they can be destroyed. Whereas intangible assets cannot be destroyed, or it cannot be burned down, or, you know, kind of like reduced to rubble in that sense. One very important differentiating factor between tangible and intangible assets is that in intangible assets, you can have multiple parties actually using that particular asset at the same time. Whereas for tangible assets, typically it's only one party that can be using it. So give an example of land. When you have a piece of land and you build a house on it, that's about the only thing you can do with it already, right? So what you can do is you can subdivide the land into smaller pieces, but at any one time, most typically, you only have one party that can use it. But for intangible assets, a lot of different parties can actually be using it. You can license to multiple people. You can sub-license it. You can also decide to say, I want to license only certain parts of it to certain people in different jurisdictions or countries. So this is actually a very powerful concept. Intangible assets allow you to multiply the usage of it very quickly to a very, very large audience. Okay, so now with this differentiated between intangible and tangible assets, the next slide I'm going to talk about. So what are the different forms of intangible assets? And then how does IP or intellectual property actually fall under this bigger class of intangible assets? So if you take a look at the top, we've kind of like segmented it into registrable as well as need not registered kind of assets. So for the topmost, registered trademarks. So this is really, trademarks is for the use to protect distinctive signs used in trade or business. So the McDonald's logo is actually one good example of this. It's probably one of the most recognizable logos. Even for small kids, they will see McDonald's, they will actually recognize it immediately. So that's for trademarks. And then for patents, right, it's actually the protection of inventions. So it must be something that you can actually come up with an invention or some kind of process to create something, right? So it's a protection of inventions. So Intel, for example, makes a lot of computer processor chips. So within those chips itself, there's a lot of inventions going on in there. So patents is, just to remember, is actually a protection of inventions. And then for registered designs, this is actually the protection of the novel, of the the outward appearance of the objects. So think about, for example, an Apple phone, how it actually looks like. The smartphones before iPhone came out actually looked very different from the current smartphones, right? So they were actually able to protect how a smartphone is supposed to look like. Other examples of registered designs typically will be used in, for example, jewelry design. So jewelry design is very unique in nature. So if you look at a piece of jewelry that's actually from, let's say, Tiffany, right? It's actually pretty obvious that this is from Tiffany. So this, just remember that registered design is about appearance, and it has got nothing to do with whether this appearance affects the functionality or not. It's purely about how it looks. Now, for the other two kinds of IP that does not actually require registration are copyright and confidential information. So copyright is really the protection of original expressions. So this could be in a manner of, a piece of writing that you have, a song, a movie, and so on. You do need, of course, to reduce into form. So when we say reduce into form, is that you cannot just have an idea. You need to put it down in writing in order for the protection to commence. So even though it doesn't need to be registered, you still need to make sure that this is actually reduced into form in writing. And there are different ways of actually protecting copyright. One of the most common ways is actually for you to, for example, get a timestamp. So if you have a writing and you want to get it copyrighted or kind of like accord a timestamp to it, you can actually upload to certain websites and they give you kind of like an electronic timestamp. Okay. And for the final piece, which is confidential information. So this is the protection of non-public information with value. So for example, in Coca-Cola, we're talking about a secret recipe that has not been reviewed. And confidential information is just that, information that has got value that we don't actually reveal to anybody. So just to make sure, confidential information, once it is being leaked, is no longer confidential. Okay, so copyright and confidential information do not need to be registered. So there are other forms of intangible assets. So for example, Google and Facebook, they hold a lot of data from their users. So when you do a search in Google, when you actually put a like and so on in Facebook, all this data are being captured. And for Google and Facebook, they're able to understand what are your preferences, what kind of news that you like to see and so on. And they can push out the data to you and news feeds to you. So data is actually a very important form of IA to different companies. And of course, if you are a pharmaceutical company, for example, like Pfizer or Roche, regulatory approvals for your pharmaceutical products. So if you launch a new drug and it gets approved, right, those are very important intangible assets as well. And then of course, for software companies or manufacturing companies such as GE and Siemens, right, system and processes are very important to them. So that's to give you a very quick overview about the different kinds of IA and IP. So there are various kinds of intangible assets that can actually reside in one single product. So don't think that one single product can only have one kind of IA or IP. So in fact, in an espresso machine as shown here, you have from the logo, which is protected by a trademark, the Nespresso logo, to the milk frother, which is protected by a registered design, how it looks, right? To the method of extracting coffee from a capsule, and that's protected by the patents, to your marketing brochures, which is protected by copyright. And then within the capsules itself, the blend of ingredients. So how much coffee to put in there, how much Robustica and how much Arabica kind of coffee actually goes into it. That's probably a trade secret or confidential information. And the coffee capsule itself is also protected by patent, registered designs and trademarks. So just remember that within a product itself, it's not exclusive, mutually exclusive. So that means it's not only protected by just one kind of IP or IA. There can be multiple different kinds of IA residing in one single product. Right, so think about what we mentioned in the previous slide on the Nespresso machine, right? So would it be easy for you to replicate the business model? So you've seen Nespresso as being successful. Can you replicate this business model quite easily? So before you can do that, you need to think, right? Whether it's easy for you to bypass the patent and the design registration and the copyright and the trademark registration, right? So is it easy for you to do that? Probably not so easy. So this chart actually shows you that with strong intangible asset, right? Your product actually has got a much more longer life cycle. and you can actually sell it at a much higher price because your strong intangible assets are actually a strong barrier to entry. So once you have a successful product protected by strong intangible assets, it's not easy for the competitor to come in to take away your market share, right? So if you are a successful product and you have a weak IA, your sales may not be as high, even though your time to actually sell it might be a bit long, might be about the same time, right? But your ability to actually sell it at a premium might be lower. And of course, if you don't even have a IA to start off, right, that's probably very difficult for you to actually make it into a successful product. Now I'd like to share with you this idea about the innovation life cycle. Because a lot of times we see products out there, which is what we call one-hit wonder. You have a successful product and then it ends there. Now, the innovation life cycle actually is very important because you need to understand that IP is not just about law. It is also about business and innovation. And in OECD's or a version of the definition of innovation, innovation is actually about taking ideas to the market. So an idea, no matter how creative or how groundbreaking, it has to be brought to the market and has a social economic impact in order for it to be really innovative, right? So an innovation that stays inside the mind of an inventor is useless. It has to be brought into the market for it to have actually a useful impact. So we came up with this chart by studying the most innovative companies and countries. And it seems that the common cycle in which innovation happens is kind of like distilled into this chart. So as you can see, innovation is a very continuous cycle of ideas. You start with the ideas at the top and turn them into intangible assets such as goodwill, data, standards, patents, trademarks, copyright, and so on. And you leverage these intangible assets to differentiate yourself from the competitors. By creating the products and services, you commercialize it, get the revenue, and then this revenue part of it, you reinvest into the business to get new ideas. So this has to be a continuous cycle. And you can see that IP is actually the vehicle in the cycle where ideas are taken to the market. Right? So when strategically and effectively used, IP enhances the enterprise's competitive edge, facilitates growth, and then you can use them to actually reach out to different kind of markets through different opportunities like sale, licensing, business, and partnerships, and so on. So at different stages also, there are different considerations, as well as people within and outside of organization that you'll be working with. So think about activities. So those are actually highlighted in orange, right? In the first part, creating IA, the proof of concept, new products and services, new packaging, registering your IP, and so on. So those are activities. And then there are people that actually you require to help you in these different processes. So at the start, you have your IP manager, for example, you have your marketing department to help you to change the ideas into assets. And then you have BD, you have your legal, you have your VC funds and so on to create the products and services. And commercialization, again, then you go back to who are the manufacturers you're working with. Do you go into JV, M&A partnerships and so on? And then you have then rethink about reinvesting back in the business. So the innovation cycle alone is not something that is the task of the IP manager alone or someone that's, for example, looking at the legal part of the business. It's actually every part of the business that will be engaged and involved in this innovation life cycle. So I just want to leave this very important concept with you. So the innovation life cycle includes everyone in the company. So it's not just the legal department's purview, right? So it's really down to every single person. So this chart I would like to share with you is something that we have actually identified, which is what we call the IA gaps of Singapore companies. So in the end of 2018, we did a consolidation of some of the IP audit reports that we have actually done for our clients. And some of the key things that we have actually identified with Singapore companies is that there is incomplete protection of intangible assets. So that's actually one of the very big gaps. We see 46% of them, in fact, don't have the right or adequate protection of the intangible assets. There's a lack of IP knowledge, about 25% of them. And then finally, I'm just going into the double digits items over here. They are unaware that FTO searches are essential. So FTO searches, let me just explain a bit, is what we call freedom to operate searches. So it actually just makes sure that whatever kind of products and services that you are going to launch does not actually infringe on somebody else's IP. Okay, so FTO searches are actually quite important, especially when you start to go overseas. Okay, at this point of time, we're just going to come up with a poll. And the poll question is that, do you know what are your intangible assets? And Tiffany, I think, has just put up the poll. So appreciate if all of you could actually help to click on it, either yes or no. Interesting numbers. Seems like most people know what their intangible assets are. So again, think of it not just from the perspective, if you're a business owner, not only just from your perspective as a business owner, what about as an individual, as an employee? Do you know what are the intangible assets within a company?
Okay, and I think, Eric, we are more or less quite done. So I'll be sharing it in now. Okay, yep, share results. Results being shared with the participants ready.
Awesome. So seems like most of you already know what your intangible assets are. So very heartening to see that. Very heartening to see that. Okay, so thanks, Tiffany. I'm just going to close this poll results. So of course, today's topic is about using your IP to grow overseas. Now you need to take care of intangible assets when you go overseas. And before we go into more details about that, I also like to share with you about how is it that your IP elements in your business planning are actually integral with your business plans as well. Okay, so from the very start of it, right, the identification of markets. So right now, let's say you have a product, you're thinking about where do you want to launch outside of Singapore. You also need to know what are your IP assets. And you also need to know what you have and what you don't have. So what you don't have, do you actually need to then go and prep it a bit better to make sure that you have adequate protection. So for the second stage, if you look at it, for the IP strategy, right, there are three different ways of looking at IP strategy. You can actually go the minimal route, you can go the defensive route, or you can actually go the offensive route. So now in the minimal route, it could be that you decide that IP is actually unlikely to significantly change your decisions with regards to product or service development. Your focus then might be to reduce risk or to avoid any kind of risk. Now, in order for you to reduce or avoid the risk, right, you of course must know where the risks lie. Now, I mentioned about FTO searches earlier on. So professionally conducted searches can be undertaken to actually help you to identify what are the prior rights in other countries that may actually pose a risk to your planned operations into moving into these countries. Now, with this knowledge of obstacles ahead, then you can actually make appropriate risk management strategies. For example, getting legal advice on, say, would you infringe on people's IP rights? And if you really have no way of not infringing, right, can you then negotiate licenses from these holders of the rights? Or can you design around and things like that? So this is really on a minimal basis, trying not to infringe on other people's right when you actually go overseas. Now, of course, if you look into the next stage, which is the defensive strategy, you want to use this strategy to actually as a shield to fend off allegations of infringement by third parties and to deter would-be infringers. So from the first step of identification of the IP assets, you identify the gaps and then plug them. So you are actively trying to file for IP filings or protection of your own products and services. You're not only just concerned with not infringing other people, you're also trying to protect your turf. And of course, in offensive, right, you're actually looking at your IP holdings itself as something that you actually make money from. So you will be actively monitoring the market for infringement activities. So for the next one, IP search on availability, you would then verify that IP assets can be used in these markets without causing any conflict with any other parties. So the next one, compliance with local IP rules and protection. And this is kind of like similar to market adaptation when you actually think about business planning. Now, from the legal aspect of it is that you want to know what are the different protection accorded in different countries. So different countries will accord the same IP right a bit differently. So for example, patents and trademarks, so they may be accorded different protection in different countries. So you need to be aware of differences. From the social aspect of it, right? Let's say we moved into another country, and for example, in Singapore, let's say litigation, just for argument's sake, is actually something that's common that you actually see. So someone infringes on your right, you actually sue them. Now, in another country, is this actually the right kind of thing to do? Is that a socially accepted kind of a norm? So you need to understand what are the different contexts in the different countries. And of course, when you file for a trademark in a different country, the same word, the same mark itself may have a very different meaning in a different country. So how do you actually contextualize it such that it's actually suitable for that particular country? And then the next stage of commercialization of IP, this can be through assignment, licensing, franchising, JV, and so on. And we'll go into a bit more details about this later on. And finally, for IP enforcement. Now, it's quite useless if you have IP rights and don't enforce them. So it's actually important for you to be actively looking out for who is actually infringing. Because if you don't, then the money they invested into your IP, it basically goes into waste. So IP enforcement is actually the next step. So this is really just to show you the alignment between IP elements as well as business planning. So now, let's talk about moving overseas. So some of the questions you want to ask yourself, right? You know, where are my key markets? How will you manage logistics? What IP does a competition own? Where might the infringing goods actually be manufactured and so on? So it's really important for you to understand what rights, when you go overseas, that you might be infringing on. Now, you may also need to make changes to your products and services to make a business model work. So by localizing, as we mentioned a bit earlier on. So the key point that I really want to emphasize again here is that doesn't mean that you can operate in Singapore and you can actually operate elsewhere. So just the fact that you can operate in Singapore doesn't mean that you can actually do it the same way elsewhere. So even for business considerations, let's say if you produce a toaster that uses, you know, Singapore's voltage, that cannot be used in, let's say, in America because theirs is of a different voltage. You need to adjust it accordingly. And so same thing as well for your IP rights, right? So you need to adjust it according to the different countries that are going into. And some of these rights, for example, patent rights, right? You need to also be very aware of certain countries. Because, for example, in US, EP, or Europe, Japan, China, and South Korea, they actually, that's where about 94% of patents actually originate from. So these are what we call the strong house of innovation, or where patents actually come from. So even though you have no interest in going to these few different countries, right, you need to be aware that the majority of patents are coming out from these countries. So you have to be aware of these innovations, and when you're doing searches, right, you need to actually also consider about these few countries, what kind of patents they have over there as well. Okay, so and then we talk about your localization, which is for trademarks, and I'll go into a bit more details into the next slide and give you an example of those as well. Okay, then there may also be IP implications in the production and delivery arrangements that you want to adopt. So if you intend to import everything into your new market, then the main concern may relate to infringement. So that means your products moving into the country, do they actually infringe on any IP rights? However, if you're setting up, let's say, an office or manufacturing facility in those countries, right, then you may want to see how the overseas laws protects confidential nature of what you do. So again, different considerations. All right, so localization challenges. So Carrefour, which you know is a French supermarket, first entered China actually back in 1995. And they use this Chinese name. Sorry for those of you who don't speak Chinese, I'll try to explain it as well. So the Chinese name used is actually Jialefu. And Jialefu not only sounds similar to the original French name, it also has a positive meaning of a happy family and prosperous life. So as you can see, they've done their homework to say that, okay, if I want to go into China, I need to give it a Chinese name. Would this actually mean anything, and how does it sound? So sound-wise, it sounds a bit like Carrefour, And of course, it has got a very positive connotation to it. Now, on the flip side, Best Buy is actually a very big American electronics group. Unfortunately, it had to close 9 of its Chinese stores in 2011 after 5 years of very challenging operations. Now, of course, there are a lot of reasons that can actually lead to the downfall. So people have said that maybe one of the downfall reasons is actually the name that they actually use. So the characters itself, 百思买, okay? So 百思 actually sounds like best. And then 买, the third character, actually is a direct translation of buy. So together, they added up to become 百思买. But in the Chinese context, if you put these 3 individual characters together, it actually means think 100 times before you buy, right? So even though it sounds like the original Best Buy name, but when translated and actually you look at it into a Chinese context, it actually has got a negative connotation to it. So trademark, especially when you go into different foreign jurisdictions, you need to understand what context it actually brings to the particular country. All right, so just to share with you these 2 interesting ones. So of course, when you move overseas, what exactly are you looking for? It could be that you're trying to go upstream to look for raw materials, look for suppliers, look for services, people who can actually develop software for you, for example, because Singapore, as we all know, is a very expensive country to actually produce or to source for materials or to look for manpower to do certain things. So you could be going upstream overseas in looking for these different suppliers for raw materials or manufacturers or services. You could also be going overseas, of course, for downstream purposes, to look for distributors, to look for franchisees, to look for agents and so on. Or you could even self-deploy yourself, that means set up a subsidiary in overseas. So exactly what are you looking for overseas? And this question will actually then bring into the next slide, which is you will have different considerations in what you're actually looking for overseas. So when you're looking upstream, right, some considerations that you actually want to look at and what are the intangible assets of yours that can actually be affected. So for example, for brands and trademark, the quality of the goods. Now, in the early days of buying products from overseas or sourcing from overseas, right, price was actually cheap. So a lot of quality issues, for example, non-conformance of parts and non-uniformity of parts were simply absorbed by a lot of buyers. However, in this current environment of tight supply chain management, right, the quality issue is becoming more and more costly and cannot be tolerated anymore. So as a result, retailers are imposing strict standards on the direct suppliers, because you need to understand that whatever they are sourcing from your suppliers and putting into your final products, right, this actually affects your final quality and affects your brand. And then this then affects people's perception of your brand. So for quality control, I think it's a very good idea for you to actually pass the buck on. So ensure that your suppliers will conform to certain strict quality standards that you have. So don't take this on upon yourself anymore. You have to ensure that your suppliers are actually also doing their bit in ensuring the quality. And I think traceability is especially important these days with F&B, because we are talking about food safety, right? So that's something you want to consider as well, especially if you are in the F&B business. For trade secrets, know-hows and patents, right? Certain considerations you want to have is whether it's going to be exclusive, so non-exclusive. So when you look for a particular manufacturer, you may want them to actually help you to produce exclusively for you, so that whatever kind of know-how that you have that you're sharing with them is not spilled over to another different company that they produce for. Now, of course, this is the ideal scenario, but a lot of times they may not necessarily be just producing for you exclusively. So in this kind of situation, right, you might actually want to go into what we call a non-disclosure agreement to ensure that whatever kind of know-how and trade secrets that you actually share with them is protected within a non-disclosure agreement. Or if you want to go into even a more next stage, which is what we call an NNN, non-disclosure, non-use, non-circumvent. So that means they cannot disclose, they will not use it outside of your arrangement with them, and they cannot circumvent it as well. right? So in terms of working with suppliers and manufacturers, this is one of the key things. Whatever kind of know-how you're telling them on how to produce your products, that is something that you have to be kept secret between the two parties. And for the question on copyright as well, right? A lot of times we will be actually commissioning a third party overseas to help us to come up with, let's say, an app, or to help you to code a certain piece of software. Now, the question of ownership is actually very important. So just to give you some context to that, in certain countries such as Indonesia and Thailand, copyright works which are created by the employee during the course of their employment are owned by the employee unless agreed otherwise. Okay, so this is quite an important point. So that means if you commission someone to do this work, let's say a company, theoretically, the employer of the company actually owns the rights unless they actually assign it to the company. So that's the default position. Now, whereas in Singapore and Malaysia, the work that's actually made by an employee during the course of your employment, by default, the copyright is actually owned by the employer. So as you see, just within ASEAN itself, there are very different default positions on the ownership of copyright when it comes to commission work. So you have to understand that when you look for different parties to be working with, right, how their copyright laws are protecting, this kind of works that's actually been commissioned. So you need to be very aware of that. And you want to also think about in situations where things do not go well. So we're talking about a jovial, a very happy business partnership, but things can go downhill very quickly. So if things go south, right, do you want to think about just purely, okay, let's go to court and settle this? Or do you want to think about what are the dispute resolution mechanisms that are actually available out there? So just to let you know, Singapore actually has just signed the Singapore Mediation Agreement, which was just signed about last year in August. So there are now avenues for you to actually go through mediation or arbitration as actually possible ways to resolve this kind of issues when it comes to IP issues. So don't always think about just pure litigation or going to court. There are other ways of actually resolving disputes and still keeping the business relationship. All right, so these are some of the upstream considerations that you actually want to consider. So this is interesting because this then comes to the previous slide, which is when you start to outsource quite a number of your manufacturing processes, there can be a situation where your contract manufacturer actually becomes your competitor. Okay, so examples of this are actually quite well spread out and quite prevalent. So a couple of companies, for example, Lenovo, Haier, which is the Chinese household appliance manufacturer, TCL is also Chinese as well, they make televisions. Now these three companies actually have now become big companies on their own right, but they just started off actually producing or making products for other international brands. Okay, why are they able to do so? Because when they start to produce, they get the know-how from all these international brands on how to manufacture the goods, and they use this know-how and they can actually start to produce their own brand goods. Right, so this is something you need to be aware of. How do you actually share enough information with your contract manufacturers, but not enough for them to actually take this knowledge to produce their own goods and services? And actually, I've got an experience to share on this on my own, right? So I used to work in HP, and as you know, HP makes a lot of computers and laptops. So what we did actually was that a lot of parts in the computer itself, for example, your cooling fan. The fan itself, there's a way of manufacturing it. So we actually protected those manufacturing methods in the form of patents. And a lot of HP's products are actually manufactured by Taiwanese companies. So we make sure that we file patents in Taiwan, protecting the manufacturing method for making the particular cooling fan. So we ensure that our contract manufacturers in Taiwan can only produce for us and not for anyone else. But of course, if they want to, we allow them, but they need to pay us like a royalty in order to use the particular way of manufacturing for creating products or cooling fans for other companies. So you have to be a bit wary sometimes when you're actually working with contract manufacturers and sourcing from overseas. So for downstream considerations, what are your expansion options, right? So you could actually start an e-commerce website, or you have a regional sales that's based outside of the foreign market, who then makes periodic visits or conducts trade shows. You can also buy a company that already has got a market and customer access so that you can actually grow your business very quickly. You could retain all ownership by setting up a subsidiary over in the overseas country. You could be looking for a distributor that can actually help you to reduce your own sales and logistic resource requirements. And then there's the other model, which is quite popular in Southeast Asia, which is the franchising model. So in franchise, you basically teach your franchisee how to sell your products and services. And also you need to provide them with the training, the ongoing assistance, and enable them to basically replicate your business, right, in another location for a fixed period of time. Now you could also develop joint ventures. So usually joint ventures happen when you need to co-develop something, some product. So you usually have a JV with a local partner. And the final one is actually setting up a IP holding company. And usually you want to do this in a favorable tax jurisdiction. Okay, so this becomes a pure IP holding company where you then license your IP to operating companies within your own company or your own group or to third-party licensees. Now, one key point to note is that whatever your downstream considerations of expanding your business overseas, right, these choices are not mutually exclusive. So you can move between these strategies or try more than one at a time. So it could be, setting up a subsidiary in country A and then doing a JV in country B and so on. But the key point to note is that whatever expansion route that you choose, you have to remember that most of the IP rights that you have developed in your home country are not automatically protected overseas. So this point I've been emphasizing quite a fair bit. So don't assume that you can operate in Singapore means that you can assume operation in some other countries. So this is a very important part. So the key difference between from downstream expansion option 1 until 8 is that in 1 and 2, right, those are what we call the less complex arrangements. Whereas moving on to the right side, those are more complex IP arrangements. Okay, so 1 and 2, as you can see, there is not much of IP that you need to be aware of. There definitely will be, but not as much. And then when you start to move into 5, 6, and 7, and 8, that's where you actually start to bring in parties on board who have a vested interest in ensuring that your rights are not infringed, right? Okay. And just to touch a bit more about the franchise model, for franchises, they typically will have a franchise agreement. And within the agreement itself, there will be certainly clauses in there that talk about the license use of your IP. And these are usually trademarks and trade secrets and probably some copyright as well. Because franchise tends to be a lot more, you see that in education and F&B as well. Okay, so these are the different considerations that you have, and just understand that the level of IP arrangements moves really from less complex from 1 until the most complex in number 8. So for downstream considerations, really the main consideration is about infringement. Okay, so be very aware that before moving overseas, ensure that you conduct your freedom to operate searches so that you can actually sell and trade your products in overseas markets. So of course, some considerations that you want to have in terms of trade secrets and copyright is that, for example, how much information do you share with your partners and the duration of the time, how long do you want to actually share this information with them? And how do you actually have a stop to say that this is the duration of time that I'm going to share my information with you. Beyond that, you have to stop operations and so on. And when you start working with downstream partners, right, one of the key things you need to also look at is enforcement. Because in enforcement itself, you need to understand who is going to do the enforcement. Is it yourself as the principal, or is it that your partners in the various countries are going to do the enforcement for you when you come across infringement? Okay, and again, for dispute resolution mechanisms, you want to look into this because, again, as with upstream arrangements, you're bound to come into some kind of disputes eventually. So is it, again, do you want to only look at litigation, or do you have other forms of mechanisms such as mediation and arbitration? Right, so this is really just to give you a quick listing about the different kinds of agreements or contracts where IP may appear. So we talked about a few of this. So non-disclosure agreements, we talked about that. So employment agreements, I'll just go quickly into that. So usually employees use a company's IP, and in addition, they will contribute to create the company IP, right? So it's very important for you to have IP covered in all such agreements, covering aspects from patenting of inventions to ownership of copyright and so on. And typically, IP generated in the course of work belongs to the company. So you may actually have an agreement with a partner. And for example, this might be an NDA, right? You have to ensure that the employees within the company itself are also bounded by the same non-disclosure agreement as well. So employment agreements, you might also want to take a look at your partner's employment agreements to see whether this kind of clauses are actually being covered in there. Okay, and then we have different kinds of other agreements such as agency agreements, franchise, distribution, manufacturing, IT, and so on and so forth. So this is really just a very quick listing for you to take a mental note to say that IP can actually exist in these different kinds of contracts. So we talked about the different kinds of downstream modes or models which you can actually expand your business overseas. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples over here. So in October 2016, ANZ actually agreed to sell its retail and wealth management business in 5 Asian markets to DBS for $110 million above the book value. So it actually started as a subsidiary in these 5 different Asian countries. But things didn't quite work out well for them. Why? Because even though they have 1.3 million customers across these 5 different countries, right? It's a lot of money for them to continue to develop the digital and internet banking requirements to meet all the regulatory requirements. So as you know, these days you need to have your 2-factor authentication and so on and so forth. So it's actually quite a big investment for ANZ to continue to service these customers. So they thought, why not, instead of continuing to operate this subsidiary, right? Can we actually sell it to a third party? And of course, DBS was more than happy to buy over this. Why? Because within this 1.3 million customers, you're talking about, there's a small portion of 100,000 wealthy customers and a total of about $23 billion of assets under management. So think of what intangible asset is DBS buying over. It's actually this customer base. It's all this contact information. And then you'll find out also about what kind of expenditure that they have, what things that they invest on, and so on and so forth. Straight away, you have access to this one big group of wealthy individuals that you can then actually start to help them to manage their wealth. So another example. So this is actually starting from a distributor to a deployment, right? So I think a lot of you will be familiar with Brompton bikes. So these are the foldable bikes that you can actually see quite commonly on the roads. How they entered the Singapore market was that they actually initially had 3 dealers in Singapore, but that didn't stop them from deploying their own flagship store in Funan recently. So it's called Brompton Junction. So as you can see, a business can actually go different ways in which they want to operate in a different country, whether it's going through a distributor, or in this case, they actually decided to deploy a shop themselves as well. Okay, so this is another very interesting example, right? So Gongcha, So back in 2009, Rodney Tang was actually the owner of RTG Holdings. He brought Gong Cha to Singapore, and I think a lot of you would love him for it because the bubble tea craze till today is actually still continuing. And just Gong Cha alone rakes in about $30 million for the RTG group. And it's by far the biggest brand that the RTG Holdings actually manages. So what happened actually in 2016 is that the franchise agreement between RTG and Gong Cha actually expired. And then Rodney subsequently discovered that Gong Cha's parent company, which is Royalty Taiwan, had actually made a huge change in its business strategy. Essentially, they actually sold the entire company, right, to Gong Cha Korea, which in turn is actually owned by a Japanese private equity firm, which is called Unison Capital. Now, then new terms were then proposed by the new owner, which were a lot more restrictive in nature. Even though over the next couple of months, he managed to negotiate much more favorable terms, but by then, he was actually started to think about, hey, all this know-how and knowledge that I built up along the years as a franchisee, right? Can I actually use this knowledge to actually now start my own brand? So that's where he then decided to shut down Gong Cha and introduce Li Ho, which actually means how are you in Hokkien. So as you can see, this is So as you can see, this is a very big change in the company's business strategy, from managing brands as a franchisee into creating and owning its own brand. Okay, so for them to actually do this, they had to change the business model quite a fair bit. So using totally different suppliers for its tea and other raw ingredients, coming up with new kinds of drinks, renovating outlets, changing a whole logo altogether, and even the packaging itself, as you can see on the left, the typical bubble tea packaging has got this plastic film that's actually kind of like a vacuum sealed at the top. Whereas the one on the right looks a bit more like a Starbucks kind of a teacup. And that's really also to facilitate you to drink some of the new concoctions they've actually made up. Right? So they have actually changed the model from a franchise to deploying their own brand. Now, of course, this whole process requires money. And in the whole process, they actually spent about $1 million to do this. And just a final case study. Hagen is actually this brand that actually manufactures milk bottles. So the traditional milk bottle is that they tend to be round in shape, whereas Hagen is much more, as you can see, cube in shape. And the previous kind of milk bottles require a lot of different kinds of attachments and maybe different kinds of bottles to store milk, to express milk, and so on and so forth. But with Hagen, they have come up with different attachments at the top to fit the same kind of bottle at the bottom. And because it's square shaped, right, it also allows you to then stack the different kinds of bottles together. So why am I bringing up Hagen is because they are actually a company that's very forward thinking and focuses quite a fair bit on IP. So what happened is that about 1 year into its initial design finalization, and just when the owner, Ms. Bock, was about to actually start to go into prototyping, right, they discovered that the design had actually been leaked, and someone else was actually about to start to mass produce the identical products. So fortunately, what they were at the point of time was they were still thinking about round bottles, but that episode led them to rethink the whole business strategy to say that, hey, if it's something that's going to be so easily copied and manufactured elsewhere, right, then how should I be protecting it? So through this experience, right, each time that they actually conceptualize a new product, they will quickly follow up that with a design and patent search and filing. So before they enter a new country, they ensure that their trademarks are clearly in place. And in fact, right, they held back the overseas launch by a full year in order to ensure that the trademarks, patents, and design registrations were actually properly filed and cleared. And they work with a lot of different international law firms, each with expertise in the different areas of IP to ensure that the IP portfolio is always up to date. So Hagen is really one of the key companies that I would like to highlight to say that they really take IP as one of the key considerations in the business strategy. Okay, so coming on to my last slide. In summary, I would just like to leave you with this a couple of parting shots, which is to increase your success overseas, you need to use your intangible assets, right? Because strong intangible assets represents a strong barrier to entry. And this allows your company to price at a premium and maintain your lead for a much longer time. Now, the second point is that you cannot watch out for what you are not aware. So if you don't know what you don't know, then I think it's a very dangerous situation to be in. So always carry out what we call a freedom to operate search. So at least you know what kind of dangers you are facing when you expand overseas. You also need to protect adequately those things that matter to you. So knowing what your intangible assets are is a good starting point, but it's not sufficient. You have to accord them with the necessary protection as well. And finally, use intangible asset strategy as part of management decision. Now, just to leave you also with this point, which is, again, IP is not just about law. It is also about how it integrates into your business and how it actually is a vehicle for you to go into the innovation lifecycle. There is a close linkage of IP and IP rights in each of this step of doing business internationally, from identification of business to business follow-up. So really that's the last point I want to leave with you, which is, keep in mind that IP and your intangible assets are very integral to your business model as well. So just the last couple of slides, which is to share with you some of the public resources that are actually available. So quite a number of things that I mentioned earlier on were actually taken from this business guides that we actually produce. So there's a total of 15 business guides from IPOS International. And so if you can flip out your smartphone and take a QR code over there, you provide you to the link where you can actually download these business guides. So 15 of them all together. So take your time to actually browse through them. Now I know that today's session is a bit rushed because I was covering quite a couple of items. But if you feel that your business has got a certain need that, or you have a certain burning question with regards to whether whether your company has got intangible assets, what are the key things to take note of in a joint venture? How do you actually start the IAA strategy, and so on and so forth, right? Again, scan the QR code. You can book with us a complimentary 45-minute chat to discuss any of these issues. And the last slide I would like to share is this one. So IP Week at SG. So this is IPOS's annual flagship event, and this is this year held over 2 days, 25th to 26th of August. And in the 9th edition, IP Week brings together IP thought leaders, legal experts, and innovative enterprises. And this event takes the form of a digital program where participants can, for the first time, attend in all of our webinars, most importantly, for free. Okay, this is complimentary. And the topics will be spanning across how IP can boost innovation, strengthen resilience and competitiveness of businesses in COVID-19, importance of brand, and valuing of intangible assets. Okay, so registration is now open. Sorry, there's no QR code over here, but what you can do is go to this link, www.ipweek.sg to register. All right, so this is in a online manner. So this is the first time we're actually doing it online. Okay, and with that, I've come to the end of my sharing and presentation. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate you staying with me throughout. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to drop me an email at my email address over here. All right, so I'll pass the time over back to Tiffany.
Okay, and thank you, Eric. Thank you so much for the for the presentation. I believe a lot of our participants have benefit greatly from it. I've seen quite a number of participants who is asking questions on more in-depth questions on their own personal company issues. Like what Eric said, for those personal questions that may be quite lengthy, we may not be able to answer during the Q&A session. So, with Eric contact, you can either drop him an email, or you can drop Singapore Chinese Chamber an email, and we'll also forward it to IPOS. Or you can scan on the QR code that was given. Not to worry if you have missed out the QR code. Singapore Chinese Chamber will be sending off the another post email to you guys, so that you guys will know how to register for your 45 minutes clinical sessions itself, to ask further details with IPOS regarding your company issues moving forward. So as mentioned, now we've come to the Q&A session. If you have any questions for the speakers, feel free to submit them by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and type in your question. Do note that as we have limited time for the Q&A sessions, we will not be able to answer all questions. Plus, we seek your kind understanding. Should your question not be answered during this session, please feel free to contact our speakers after the presentation or email SCCCI, and we will forward your inquiries to them. Okay, so back to, Eric down here. Eric, we have so many questions, like 30 over questions on the board. So I'll immediately jump to the first questions, which I see that there's 6 upvotes in total. Okay, the first question goes like that. Are there any current government support initiative for SMEs to help protect their IP and patents rights? So I think maybe, IPOS is definitely the one to go to. So maybe, Eric, you can, further elaborate, what can IPOS help them, and what are the free clinical sessions that probably they should sign for at the end of the day?
Okay, so there are a couple of supports available. So let me talk about first external of IPOS. So for example, there's this market readiness, so it's called MRI in short. So it's actually offered by ESG. So what it helps is that, so for quite a number of the things that I talked about when going overseas, for example, freedom to operate searches, finding out what is the landscape over in overseas, right? That is actually one of the key initiatives that's from ESG that can actually help to fund you to carry out this kind of services with professionals. So that's one of the key ones you want to look at, MRI. And then the other one within IPOS itself is that what we try to help with a lot of companies is that we know getting, for example, a patent is actually a very lengthy process. So what we have actually done is that we have expedited some of our patent grants in certain areas. So just to give you a context, right? When you actually file for a patent overseas, you can expect grant times of maybe a couple of years. So we are talking about maybe between 2 to 5 years. And that usually for a lot of companies is a very long period of time. So they start to file a patent and don't realize that actually, taking a patent to grant would take about 3 to 5 years, right? So in Singapore, what we have is a fast track kind of initiative. So the patents can actually be granted in as quickly as 6 months. So only for specific technical fields. And for the details of that, you can drop me an email and I can just point you to the link to say that what are the specific tech fields that actually qualify for this fast track. So what's important is that once you have this fast track going on, you can then use the Singapore application to actually make the grants in other countries a lot faster as well. So instead of waiting for 3 to 5 years, it could possibly be actually shortened. So those are the couple of initiatives that we have within IPOS and as well as from ESG.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Eric. Thanks for the brief intro for it. The next question we have is that companies would like to find out how do they use the FTO search, because I think in the earlier on slides we have talked about FTO. So maybe you can elaborate where to do the search and the main purpose of it.
Right. So really for FTO search is you want to ensure that when you launch a product in a foreign country, you're not infringing on anybody's rights. So when we talk about rights, 3 key ones, right? Number 1, of course, is trademark. So let's say you launch your brand XYZ in Malaysia. So is there a similar brand there that is also called XYZ? So does it allow you to actually still then file for a trademark over there or launch a brand over there? So that's one of the key considerations. You need to search. And for trademark search, it's a bit more easier. You can actually just go to the Malaysian website, or if you're launching in Malaysia, or you can actually go to WIPO's website where they actually allow you to do this kind of searches. It's a quick and dirty search, so I would actually still advise that you will probably want to engage the services of a law firm to actually help you to carry out a much more complete search. And in terms of patents, you're talking about a product when you launch in a different country, whether it actually infringes on the patent over there. So patent searches are a bit more complicated because you can't really see, it's not like the trademark where it's actually quite obvious, right? Patents are actually worded in such a way that it's a bit difficult for you to say, does this actually infringe on a patent that's actually existing in another country? So patent searches would best be actually conducted by a professional, such as a law firm, or if you would like to actually, within IPOS International itself, we also provide that service as well. So if you want to, just drop us a note. And again, likewise for design registrations on the outlook of your product, right? If your product is going to look very similar to something that's actually protected overseas, right? So can you actually still enter that space? So those are the three, I would say, key criteria that you want to actually look at.
Okay, Kensha, thank you, Eric. You know, like what we always inform the participants, if you're not too sure, you know, what are the things that probably you can get it patent, you know, or how to go about in details, or how to even get it patent, you know, in the global aspects, do feel free to drop Eric, you know, because each individual company it can be different. So it has to be case by case where IPOS have to guide you accordingly to it. So moving forward to the next question, we have with us with Andrew. Andrew, I think is from the technology industry. You know, his question is that in this fast-paced industry such as technology, where it is common for software innovations to be released to market quite quickly, how do we balance patenting together with time to market? You know, does going to market early with a MVP harm the potential to get ideas patent? I think this you know, a problem with technology where, you know, things are moving so quickly, you know. So how do you go about, you know, getting it patent and moving it forward, you know, so that you don't lose out in the market? Yep.
Yeah, so thanks, Andrew, for that question. I know it's a common question that a lot of people ask. It's like, so if this is a fast-moving field, do I actually still want to actually patent it? So one of the key considerations you can actually make is that now the code itself, right, is actually protected by software. So I think the bare minimum you need to do is actually have your copyright protection. So get the timestamp, like I mentioned earlier on, to ensure that your code is actually protected. That's one of the key things that you can do for practically very cheaply and very quickly. Now, in terms of patenting, right? Yes, we are aware that software is a very fast-changing field. But the fact is, if you don't actually protect it, that means anyone can actually use the same software and kind of like produce the effect that they actually want to. So one of the key things you want to consider is that you may not necessarily want to go through the whole process of getting the patent to grant, because it could be that you start a patent application process, which again, as I said, it takes a couple of years for it to get granted. Along the way, you just have to take a look at the market. If the market is no longer using this particular software solution, right, you can actually just decide to not pursue it further. You can actually drop the patent application. So you actually save on the cost in that way. But if you see that this is going to be the next big thing that, you know, a lot of different companies are going to use the same kind of solution everywhere else, then I think it's going to be beneficial for you to continue the prosecution of the patent. Now, as I mentioned earlier on as well, we have a couple of initiatives over in IPOS, which is to help exactly this kind of issue. So for example, AI patents, we actually can grant very quickly. We're talking about under 6 months. So those are some of these initiatives that we within IPOS, we have actually tried to help with companies like yourself.
Okay, thanks, Eric. I hope that answers Andrew's questions. Next up, we do have someone. I think it's quite a good question on this. Is that can a patent be simply an idea, like extraction of coffee from a capsule as per Nespresso, or must substantial development be made on it first in order to secure a patent? I think the main thing about, you know, coming to patent right is like, at which juncture should I start to get the patent you know, process ongoing at a, you know, with IPOS, you know, moving forward down there. So I think, Eric, maybe you can address on this question.
Okay, so the key point to take note is that between trade secret and patent, right, it's just a very fine line. So the moment that you actually disclose whatever your idea is, it's no longer a trade secret. And the only form of protection that you have is going to be for patent. Okay, so your idea now, the key thing that you want to think about is it going to be easily reverse engineered? So that means if I put this product out into the market, is it going to be easily reverse engineered? So anybody looks at it, okay, I know how to produce it. Now, if that is going to be the case, right, then I would say patent protection is important. Whereas if it's not going to be easily reverse engineered, so the formulation, no matter how you try it and understand and take a look at it, and you can't really tell at what percentage of something goes into that or what components, right? Then you might want to consider actually trade secrets, because trade secrets is essentially a very low cost method. But the problem with trade secret is that the moment it is being leaked, so that means somehow someone in your company knows the formulation and this formulation gets leaked, right? You really don't have much recourse. Once it gets leaked, anybody can actually start using it. So that's really the key comparison to say that, do you want to go into a patent or a trademark? Between a trade secret or a patent.
Okay, can share. Thanks, Eric. Next off, we have Christina. Christina, I think she's running more of a training school down there, where she's run a training and coaching program. So her question is, how does she, protect her training methodology and training materials? Does she have to trademark, my methodology and training materials, or do I have to engage a lawyer to do that? I remember I saw in the other post is that most of her materials are maybe extracted from textbooks and stuff. So maybe Eric, you can address on Christina's inquiries.
Okay, so for training materials, essentially, of course, if you extract from textbooks, right? But I think you have a way of arranging it such that it becomes your own product. So barring the fact that you take lock, stock, and barrel, I'm sure you would have made some adjustments to it along the way, right? So every expression of this is actually your own copyright. So I would say the primary form of protection you will be looking at is actually copyright. Now, for the way in which I would say maybe how you train and so on, it's probably going to be much more trademark in nature, which is, this is the school of teaching certain things, and how is it that your brand name gets associated with the method of pedagogy and so on. So that's probably much more of a trademark nature. So I'm looking at it, I would say two main forms. Your training materials is going to be copyright, and then the way in which you conduct, that's going to be much more of a trademark basis.
Okay, thanks, Eric. I hope that helps to answer Christina's questions. Okay, we do not really have much time, so probably I'm going to take about another 2 to 3 more questions, and we're going to end off the whole session. But for those participants, not to worry if you have posed the question as a non-anonymous, where you leave your name and contact details. IPOS will be writing you an email to address on the concerns that you have posted your questions on the Q&A sessions moving forward. Okay, next I do have Francis. Francis is saying that if an invention is originated in Singapore, but the headquarters of this company is based in China and only having a rep office in Singapore, is it necessary to register it in Singapore, since the headquarter will handle the IP registrations in China only?
Okay. So in terms of patent filing, right, it's not necessary for you to actually file in Singapore first. You can actually file overseas. So even if your, how should I say, even if a company is based in Singapore, right, there's no necessity for you to actually first file in Singapore. But of course, in order for you to first file overseas, you need to have what we call a Section 34 clearance. So it's essentially getting approval from IPOS to say that I want to first file my invention overseas. So Section 34 really just talks about this special form, which kind of like just to make sure that your invention does not talk about anything that's related to defense or that's detrimental to Singapore as a whole. So as long as those criteria are actually satisfied, you can actually first file outside of Singapore if you want to. That's for first filing outside of a key country that you're based in. Now, to your question about you're based in China and then the invention is made in Singapore, do you need to file in Singapore? No, you can actually file anywhere else that you want to. But the very important thing is that you need to attribute the inventorship to whoever that actually invented this invention. Okay, so because that's actually a very key important factor. So whether your inventor is based in Singapore or China or wherever else might be, as long as this person was involved in this whole inventorship process, you have to ensure that their names are actually also included in that application form.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Eric. Eric, I do have another question by Christina. It's more of the timestamp, because she said that you have mentioned that with the loading of the content on the internet, it is considered as a record of copyright with timestamp.
Yes.
So what is included on a website, LinkedIn, social media posting, or how about email? Does that all means, with the timestamp, it also can be recorded as a copyright? So maybe we can address more on like the records of the copyright, what are the avenues that we can go into for the companies?
Right. So as long as anything that you have actually reduced into writing, right, whether it's going to be a LinkedIn post or Facebook or your email exchanges, right, all these items, as long as you can convert them digitally, you can actually get a timestamp. So sometimes it might be, you actually wrote something to somebody and sharing of an idea and said, okay, this is what I'm going to do and so on. And this is an expression of your maybe your training materials and so on. You want to get it timestamped, so you just need to kind of like, export the file and then upload it into certain websites. So for example, for WIPO, they have this website which is called WIPO Proof, Proof. So you can upload these different documents onto there. I think you pay like about $30 Sing dollars per upload, if I'm not wrong. I think it's about the amount. You get a timestamp, so it accords you a timestamp to say that this was actually when this piece of writing was actually being made. So I think that's important for you to go and track, and it is actually being lodged with WIPO, so it's actually a very viable source. So that's one of the repositories you can actually think about when you want to do this timestamp for copyrights.
Okay, sorry, but what about social media? Social media is also all right? Because
yeah, same thing as well. Because in social media, you may have actually certain writings in there, right? So just remember that it's an expression of yourself. So you've actually written certain things over there. So it's an expression. So it is your own copyright. So if somebody wants to actually take this piece of information and replicate it elsewhere, it can be actually an infringement of copyright. So just bear in mind that putting it out in the public doesn't mean that you're allowing people to take it. Okay, so this is a very important piece in copyright. So just make sure that you will be actively looking out for people who actually take your materials. Again, just to repeat, putting your writing or your information out on the public domain does not equate to allowing people to take it for free. Okay, so this is the basic underlying concept that you need to know. So whether it's going to be a social media, Facebook post, LinkedIn, and so on and so forth, it is still your own copyright.
Okay, can share. Thanks, Eric. Okay, we do have another, Wei Zhang is saying that for companies that have not fully developed the product but wish to raise funds for ideas from outside investors, okay, will filing for a patent right still be appropriate, or will other methods come into play, such as signing of non-disclosure agreement, NDAs, moving forward? I think this for companies, many companies who are probably developing their products as per se. So probably we can address it on it again.
Sure. So if you want to actually start commencing discussions with any potential investors, I would always say that if you have the means and the money to do it, right, always go and first file for your patent application first. But of course, bearing in mind that patent applications are not cheap. So when we're talking about initial filing, you're probably looking in the range of between, I don't know, maybe about 5,000 to 10,000 Singapore dollars for one invention in one country. So that is a starting point. Now, if funds is an issue, right, then maybe what you want to do is, before you actually file for a patent application, the best way is then actually to get your potential investors to actually sign an NDA. And I think a lot of investors will be cognizant of the fact that you are a startup and that you have limited funds. They would love to hear your idea, and most of them would be probably okay to actually go into an NDA with you. Now, of course, you have to ensure that the NDA terms are a bit fair as well. You can't actually tie a potential investor for infinity for not sharing your idea and so on and so forth. So it's the NDA clauses within there itself, right? It's also up for negotiation. So you could have a more generous terms in terms of the NDA, which is the duration of time. Maybe instead of the usual time period, which you're looking at maybe 2 to 3 years, you can actually shorten it to 1 year or something. So that's something you can actually negotiate with your potential investor. So yeah, NDAs definitely is one way to go if you want to discuss your invention with a potential investor.
Okay, can share. Thanks, Eric. Okay, because of the limited time, we're going to take the last question by Sean Mark. Okay, it's more for designers. So I believe he's a designer agency. So he's saying that for design agencies providing design services for a paying client, does IP of created work reside with the agency or the client, assuming if we have not made explicitly like in contracts that we surrender IP to the client? Are there common laws here in Singapore that protect creative works? I think this is more common for design, companies, when they have to show clients their work, is there any way to protect them, by showing it to the client and not have even, let's say contract is not being signed because we don't want after you show your design work to the clients and the clients take your work and, don't sign the contract with you. So maybe how can they protect themselves or designers, design agencies in general?
So just to clarify on the question, is this based on a business-to-business interaction or is it a personal to a business? Because I wasn't quite sure about the...
Okay, it's for a paying client, so we believe it's for B2B.
B2B, okay.
Yep.
Okay, so when you talk about a design, I don't know, there's many different ways of looking at it, right? So is it a design for, I don't know, an architecture? Is it a design for a product and so on and so forth? So there's many ways of actually looking at it. One of the most basic way of protecting is actually, again, back to copyright, because this is an expression of your ideas. So once there's an expression, right, that can actually be copyrighted in a sense. So if you have a design that you actually come up with, you could take a photo, and again, like what I mentioned earlier on, you can actually upload that to the repository, get a timestamp to say that, okay, this is actually my copyright as of this time. So when you're actually sharing this with your client, you might want to tell them that, hey, actually, this is actually being protected by copyright, and this is my rights, so that they are aware that you are serious about protecting your IP. Because a lot of times it might be you're talking to a company and they think that, okay, this is just a draft, so I don't really need to accord too much attention to it. So in your interactions and your engagements with your clients, you have to make it known to them to say that, look, even if this is a draft, right, there are IP protections that are being accorded to it. Okay, so just make sure that the communication is clear so that the client doesn't take you for a free ride. Because I know this is quite a common issue that a lot of designers will face, but just be upfront with the client and share with them. And a lot of times it's not really about whether you have the protection or not. It's about making clear that you are serious about the work that you produce, and you would like the client also to respect your IP rights as well. So just let them know that, look, this might be a draft, but it still has got certain IP protection. So that's, I think, a very important point for you to communicate when you're actually showing the designs and your drafts to your clients.
Okay, Ken, sure. Thanks, Eric. That will be the final questions for today. So thank you so much for participating in today's event, and a big thank you to Eric once again for his time and valuable sharing today. We hope that the participants have benefited a lot from the webinar, and we would like to also invite you to participate in a quick survey feedback form by clicking on the link that will appear after you have left this webinar session, so that we can tailor better events for you in future. So we have come to the end of the session, as we look forward to seeing you again in our future events. Stay safe and healthy, and thank you and goodbye.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks, everyone.